Functions in JavaScript. Functions are reusable sets of instructions. So, for example, in the sequence selection and loop exercise, you were adding a bunch of script to the page, and it was getting kind of messy. There was a lot of single lines of code all kind of piling up without a lot of order or organization to them. What we can do with functions is we can take that stuff, stick it inside of something that has a name, and then run that function when we want to run that set of instructions. We can make functions so that they're reusable, so that you can use them in multiple places within your programs. And that's where functions can become very powerful. So here I have a function called doStuff, which is going to run something similar to what we did in the sequence selection and loop exercise. So let's give this a try real quick. I'm going to switch over to my code editor over here. And you can see I've already set up a file, and I recommend you do the same. With it's just an HTML file with an H1, and I've got a script here, and I've got some of the script from our sequence selection and loop exercise. And now I'm going to add a function. So to do that, I would just define a function here. Function. Use the function keyword. Do stuff. Parentheses and curly braces. Now this stuff can just go inside the curly braces. Like that. It's probably best to tab it in so it's clear that it's all inside there. So that's inside of there. And then you have to run the function. Do stuff. So we define the function, which tells it what it does. Then we invoke or call or run the function. Any of those verbs will do. Invoke, call, or run. So I can save that, and I can come over to my page here. So this is that same page. And I can run this, and you can see that the function runs, and it does its thing. It's very normal when you start doing this, and sometimes I still do it, to forget to call the function, which will mean that you'll get nothing because it'll be defined, but it won't actually run. So it's not actually running there. I have to run do stuff. Okay, so normally I would do that here in the file. Do stuff. We'll run that function. Here's a good thing to try. Go back to the basic challenges that we just did and pull one of them out of there and turn it into a function. I used challenge number 7, but you could use any of them really. See if you can turn it into a function and run it. And pause the video, and when you come back, we'll see what you got. I hope you were able to try that. I went and got a challenge. I went and got challenge number 7, and I have it over here. So here's challenge number 7. How would I take that and turn it into a function? Well, I could do it like this. I could take all of this stuff and I could come over here and I can go ahead and just paste it right on my page here, right in my file here, down here at the bottom. I'm going to just paste it on in there. But I'm going to make a new function. And, what is this thing doing? Well, it's checking a number. So I'm going to make a function called checkNum, parentheses, curly braces, like so. And then I'm going to take this stuff and I'm going to stick it inside of checkNum. Tab that in so it's clear that this curly brace is ending that curly brace and that everything is inside. It's always good to be clear about your indenting if you possibly can. It really does help. And then down here I'm going to run checkNum. And let's see what happens. So over here, when I run my script, it says enter a whole number, 54, and then you entered a really big number. So my function is running, it's functioning, it's doing what it's supposed to do. And all that code is now inside of a function. Functions are even more useful if you can pass data into them so that they can do something with that data. So for example, our first do something message, the first do something function wasn't really useful because it was just taking that string and making it uppercase and then spitting it back out again. But we could make it more useful by passing in a message variable, a parameter. This function has a parameter called message. We could pass in a message as an argument to this function, and it'll take any message and make it uppercase and console log it out. So let's give that a try and see what that does. Down here, I'm going to comment these out. I'll leave the functions. They're not going to hurt anything. But I'm going to comment these out so they don't run. And then I'm going to make a function print message, which takes message as a parameter, or print uppercase, or I forget, what did I call it over here? Probably should make it match what's on print upper message. Let's do that then. Upper message. It doesn't matter really what you call it. And then I'm going to take message and I'm going to say, var upper message equals message dot to uppercase. And then I'm just going to console log out upper message. Now when I run this, I run upper message, but I pass in, here is a message. I can pass any message in that I want and it will make it uppercase. Still not super interesting, but it's something that shows us how this actually works. So over here, when I run this, my message is turned into uppercase because that's what that function does. It takes some data and does something to it. And beyond that, we could do something like add numbers together. Again, not super exciting, but we could pass in two parameters here, a number 1 and a number 2. We could add them together and then console log them out. And you would run this by using add nums, and you would pass in the whatever two numbers you want to add there. Let's give it a try real quick. Function add nums. We're going to pass in num1 and num2. I like putting these extra spaces in here, even though that's kind of not the standard, but I think it makes it easier to read for me. All right, so then I'm going to make var sum equal num1 plus num2. And here we're using the plus sign to actually do addition. That's what we want it to do. And then I'm going to console.log sum. Meanwhile, I'm going to comment that out so we don't get that running as well. And then down here, I just need to run it with whatever numbers I want to add. Add nums 329, comma 419. Sure, you could probably do that in your head fairly quickly, but why bother? We can have JavaScript do it for us, right? So if we're going to learn how to do this JavaScript stuff, we might as well do something useful, like add those numbers together to get 728. Maybe not super useful, but you get the idea. And that's a really powerful thing about JavaScript, is we can pass in data through these variables here that we can then work with within our function. the next thing to talk about is returning data. So far, our functions have just done one thing. They've printed out to the console log, because that's really all we have for right now. We will be doing more interesting things, I promise, but for right now, what we have is to print out to the console log. But we can make functions that return something. And that, in this case, it looks subtle. The difference is subtle because in the end, what we have is the console, so we're printing to the console. But here I've updated my function. I'm calling it return sum. And instead of just printing to the console, I'm returning the sum of these two numbers. And then I can console log that out. Again, it's just going to the console, so it's the end result isn't all that different, but there is a subtle but important difference between these two things. So let's do this really quickly. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to just copy my addNums function and paste it, comment that out for a moment, and instead call this return sum, num1, num2. But instead of console logging it out, I'm going to return as a keyword, sum. So it's going to return the value here. And then I can, again, it's just going to go to the console log because that's all I've got access to at the moment. We'll be doing more stuff later. And I can run inside the console log, return sum, and I can put a 3 and a 5 in there, or whatever. And you'll see when I run this over here, assuming I typed that all right, that in fact I get an 8. And it's still going to the console. So you might wonder, well, what's the big deal here? What's the difference here between returning the sum and just having it print out the finished thing here? The analogy that I like to use is one where you're washing your clothes. If you happen to have a washer and a dryer, you have two machines, and those machines work together. So you put your dirty clothes in the washing machine, so you're feeding it in dirty clothes, dirty laundry, and you're putting in soap and you're putting in water, and the washing machine agitates it all and runs it all together. And what it returns to you are clean, wet clothes, which you then put into a dryer. And the dryer will then do its function, which will tumble the clothes with air, hot air maybe, and then return to you clean, dry clothes. So you can think of returning as a machine doing something and processing something, doing something to it, and then returning the result to you so that you can then turn it over to another machine that has its special features and does what it needs to do. Let's take a look at a useful example. This will show us something that a function can do for us in JavaScript right now, and that we could use in some programs that we write. And that is for generating random numbers. Try this out. JavaScript has a random number generator. And I'm going to just give this a try over here on my file. First of all, I'm going to comment that out so I'm not getting that. But I'm just going to console.log math with a capital M .random. And we'll talk more about what that means in a little bit. But math random is going to generate a random number. So now if I go over to my browser and run it, you see that I get a number. And I can keep refreshing my screen and I'll keep getting numbers. The numbers that I get will be from 0 all the way down to 0.000000000, all the way up to almost 1. You saw a minute ago, I got a 9.9 something or other. So it won't go all the way to 1. It'll go to not up to 0.999999999, something like that. But it won't go all the way to 1. It could go all the way to 0, but it won't go all the way to 1. But it's somewhere in there. So what if I wanted random integers? What if I wanted to get a random number between, say, 10 and 52 or something like that? How would I do that? I need to write a function to do that in JavaScript, because the random number generator in JavaScript generates random numbers between 0 and almost 1. 0 inclusive, 1 exclusive. It's the way that's officially said. So we can see that that's what's going on here. But if I was playing a game of cards and I had numbered my cards 1 through 52, and I wanted to make sure I could pick a random card, I would need, to be able to pull out a 26, not a 0.35979558399127143. That's not very helpful. So I need to figure that out. And before we go forward with this, I should mention that the random number generator in JavaScript is not truly random. It's using an algorithm to generate the random number, and it's random enough for our purposes, but it's not a truly random number. And if you were making a game that was, making a program that really needed to be random, like a lottery generator or something like that, you would want to use something other than the built-in random number generator. But for our purposes, it's random enough. So that's worth mentioning as well. Here's our first step in creating our random integer generator. Is we're going to make a function called randomInt, and we're going to pass in a minimum number that we want to get and a maximum number that we want to get in our random integer generator. And to start with, we need to know how many values we think we should be able to get. So I'm going to make a variable called number of values, and it's going to take max, and it's going to subtract min, and it's going to add 1 to it. So think of it like this. If I were to run this function with 5 and 10, if I wanted to get a random number that was between 5 and 10 and included 5 and 10, the numbers I could get are 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. That's 6 possible values. So if I take the maximum, which is 10, and subtract 5, that gives me 5 plus 1. That would give me 6 possible values. So that's how this actually works. So let's go ahead and go over to our code editor and start writing this function. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to comment that out. I don't really need that at the moment. But I'm going to make a function called randomInt. And it's going to take a min and a max. And I'm going to have a variable here, var num of values. And that's going to be the max minus the min plus 1. Do it like that. There we go. That looks nice. Okay, great. And then I can just console log out this number of values just to make sure it's working right. Console.log. And when you're working with programming, you want to do this. You want to just check everything, as many places as you possibly can, just to make sure you're getting what you think you're getting. Num of values. So I'm going to console log that out. And then down here, I'm going to run this function, randomInt. I'm going to put in a 5, and I'm going to put in a 10, and we'll see we should get a 6, right? That's what we should get. So let's go over and check that. And sure enough, I'm getting a 6, because the possible values, if I'm going to include, if I'm going to say I want random numbers from 5 to 10, I want to include 5 and 10. So I could get a 5, a 6, a 7, an 8, a 9, or a 10. That's 6 possible values. So step 1 of this is correct. And then we'll go on from there to the next step. In the second step for our random integer generator, I'm going to actually generate my random number. And so random num here is going to be between 0 and 1. And I'm going to take that and multiply it by the number of values and see what I get. So let's go ahead and add this to our function over here. So we've got that in there. We can get rid of this. We know that that's working, so we know that's all good. But now I'm going to get var random num and have that equal math.random. So that's going to generate my random number. And then I'm going to say, what did I name this variable over here? I've forgotten already. Random value, random val. I'm going to take var random val and have that equal random num times number of values. And let's just see what that gets us. Console.log random val. Try that out. Let's go over here and run that. And now that's getting me numbers that are between 0 and 6. It won't go all the way up to 6. It'll get me to 5 point something or other, but it won't go all the way up to 6. That's interesting. Great. So we're making progress. Let's see what we need to do next. Next, I'm going to use the math.floor method to round down my random number. So now that should get me a number that's a whole number between 0 and 5. So I'm going to add this variable rounded random value, and I'm going to use the math floor and pass in this random value here. This is my number with all the decimal points. So I'm going to put that decimal place is only one decimal point, but the number with all the numbers after the decimal point. There we go. That's the way I should say that. Okay, so let's give that a try over here. I'm going to get rid of this console log. I don't really need that one anymore. But instead, I'm going to do var rounded random val. Kind of a long variable name. You could make it shorter. And I'm going to do math.floor. Floor is a method and ceil is a method, ceil for ceiling. So floor will round it down, ceil, C-E-I-L, will round it up, short for ceiling, if that makes sense. And then I'm going to pass in there random val. And once again, just to see what my progress is, I'm going to console.log rounded random val. And you saw I didn't have to actually type that. I just pressed tab because it came up in Visual Studio Code. That'll keep me from getting these long variable names wrong. I could just do RRV or something like that to make it shorter, but that's okay. I'm just making it match my images here so you get a sense of what's going on here. Okay, so now when I run this, I get a 2, I get a 5, I get a 0, I get a 2, I get a 3, 5, 0. So now I'm getting whole numbers, but they're not from 5 to 10. They're between 0 and 5. But I am getting 6 of them because I'm getting 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. But I'm not getting the numbers between my range that I really wanted. But that's okay. Let's see what we can do next. And now, what we can do next is we can get our final number, and we're gonna take the min and add it to that random val. So for example, if our random number gave us a 0 and we add 5 to it, we'll get a 5. If we got a 1 and we add 5 to it, we'll get a 6. all the way up to 10. So that will give us our random numbers between 5 and 10 if we add the min value to this final number here. So let's go ahead and add that in there and see what we get. Var final num equals min plus rounded random val. And we can console log that out. Come back and check it. And you can see now I'm getting random numbers that can go as high as 10 and as low as 5. And our random number generator is actually working, which is great. In the next step, we're going to make our random number generator, our random integer generator, a little bit more useful. Currently, it works. We can generate random numbers. But the only thing we can do with these random numbers is see them pop up in the console, which is really not very useful. If I wanted to actually take this 9 and do something with it, I can't. All this function does currently is print out to the console. What we could do instead is we could return the final number. Return final number. If I could type, that would help. So here, now we can return the final number, and we could actually use this function somewhere useful. So for example, if I had an array, var foods equals square bracket cheese, chicken, grapes, hamburgers, whatever you want to put in there is fine. We could add more things to the list. But if I wanted to randomly get an element from this array, I could, because random int returns a number, I know this starts with 0, 0, 1, 2, 3. So I want a random number from 0 to 3 in this case. So I could come down here and I could say console.log, let's say foods square brackets, and in here I'm going to pass in random int 0, 3. And now, because this random int 0, 3 is going to be, because it returns final number, it's going to be a 0, a 1, a 2, or a 3. So console log foods random int 0, 3 is going to go into the array and get me either a cheese, a chicken, a grapes, or a hamburgers. Let's see if that works, if I typed it right. And sure enough, I got hamburgers, and then I got grapes, and then I got chicken. So that's working just fine. And I can actually use my random number generator to actually do something with another program. So you can think of this, because this thing returns a random number, I can use that within my tool here to get something out of this array. Going back to the washing machine and dryer kind of example, this is my washing machine. It's returning to me a processed number that I can then use with foods to do something. I don't know. It's not that interesting, but it's a little bit more interesting than what we've been doing so far. Okay, great. One last thing to look at and think about for this is that this function is pretty long. We could refactor it. Remember, we want to refactor as much as we possibly can. So what we could do is we could refactor this thing down quite a bit here. What we want to return is really this, math floor random val. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to stick it down here. Did I select that right? There we go. Oh. I'm going to return I'm going to do that, but in here what I'm going to take is I'm going to say really what I want is I want this max plus min. I want to put that in here. I'm going to put that in its own set of parentheses, max min, times my math.random. I'm going to do that, and then outside of this, I'm going to add plus min. I believe that will work. I think I have that right. Let's see if I have that right. I'm going to comment this stuff out for the moment. I'm pretty sure that's right because I'm going to return. I'm going to take math floor. I'm going to take my max, subtract my min, and add 1. Multiply that by math random. I'm going to round that down and add min. And that should be doing the same thing as this. Let's see if I did that right. Over here, if I run this again, I am still getting my items here. So this is a shortened version of all of this stuff. Now, you might look at this and go, well, I don't really understand what's going on here. And that's a great place for a comment. So here you could say something like, you know, creating a random integer from min and max. Or you could put a more explicit statement in here. Sometimes taking a big chunk of code and reducing it down to one line can be difficult to understand exactly what it's doing later. But in this case, I kind of like it because if you were to go looking around on the web for a random integer generator for JavaScript, if you Google that, you'll get statements that look like this. You'll get functions that look like this. You'll find them on Stack Overflow and other places. So it's kind of useful in this case. Sometimes these one-line statements where everything's reduced down become very difficult to read and understand exactly what they're doing. But I think this one's pretty good. So I kind of like it. Okay, so that allows us to create a random integer generator that we then refactored down into one line of code. But by walking through the steps, you could sort of see each step along the way and how that actually worked. We have a few more things to talk about in terms of functions before we're done with this lesson. And the next thing is that functions in JavaScript can be anonymous. And one of the important things to understand about the way functions work in JavaScript is that functions are first-class citizens in JavaScript, which means you can assign a function to a variable the way you could assign a string to a variable or a number to a variable. And in fact, you can use a function wherever you can use data in JavaScript. And it's one of the very powerful features of JavaScript. If you'll recall, we talked earlier about the fact that JavaScript has some features that are really best-in-class features for any programming language. And this is one of them. This is really a very powerful feature of JavaScript. So you can actually assign a function to a variable. And that function doesn't have to have a name. It can be nameless. It can be anonymous. There are times when this is very useful, especially if you're making a function that's really only going to be used once or in one context. Then there's really not a reason to create a named function if you're not going to use that name over and over and over again or in different places in your script. So function expressions are useful for that. They're useful for other things as we get into more sophisticated JavaScript. But for right now, I just want you to be aware of what they are. We won't be using them much for a while, but eventually you'll be using function expressions if you keep working with JavaScript. So let's actually see what this looks like in our code over here. I'm going to come over to my editor here, and I'm going to leave that. That's all fine. But I'm going to make a variable called greeting, and I'm going to assign it a function. And you'll see that this function doesn't have a name. It's just an anonymous function. And we could do whatever we want in here. I'm going to just for right now just do console.log hello from the function. My slide has something a little bit more sophisticated on there, but for right now, this will just do for us just to sort of see what this does. And then in order to call this function, again, remember we have to invoke the function. We have to call it or run it. I run greeting as if it were a function, which seems kind of weird, but that's the way it works in JavaScript. Greeting parentheses. So we run that like a function. And now if I come over to my console over here and run this, I'm getting hamburgers again, then I'm getting hello from the function. Hello from the function. So that function is actually running. So that's kind of important to understand. And again, this is called a function expression, and it's because functions are first-class citizens in JavaScript that we're able to assign a function to a variable just as if it were data. The next thing to understand about functions in JavaScript, and I'm not going to demonstrate this now, but I just want to call your attention to it because if you're looking on Stack Overflow, or if you're looking up scripts online and seeing other kinds of things, you will see arrow functions. And this is, again, part of ES6 or ES 2015. It brought this new syntax, and we'll come to it not in this course, but in the third course. We'll actually start working with arrow functions. But I want to mention them now because you'll see them around, and when you look at them, you'll look at them and go, what's this? We haven't done this in JavaScript yet. So I just want you to be aware that it's just a slightly different syntax for writing functions. So here I have a function that should look fairly familiar. I've got a greeting, hello, and good morning. And then I've got function capitalize, and I'm passing in a string, and then I take that string and uppercase it, and then I return any string. So this function is going to return this string uppercased. And this is should be fairly familiar from doing this lesson so far. We've seen this kind of thing, and that's not too different from what we've seen. Whereas here, we're using the function expression. I have a variable called capitalize expression, and that has an anonymous function that takes a string, and then it takes that string and makes it uppercase and returns it. So this variable will become the uppercase string that gets passed in when it's run. And that's the variable expression, the function expression that we saw just a few minutes ago. Now, when we use the arrow functions is a different syntax for a function expression. And in fact, sometimes they're officially called arrow function expressions. So we can make a variable capitalize arrow and any string, and then instead of the word function, we can just put in this equal sign and the greater than sign to make an arrow, and it'll take any string, and we can take any string and uppercase it and return that. So this becomes like one line, which is one of the reasons why these arrow functions have become popular, is they really do kind of lead to shorter shorter code and less syntax to have to deal with. Although when you look at them, it can be a little bit harder to understand exactly what's going on here. But all three of these functions are actually doing the same thing. They will all return the exact same data. So that's kind of an important thing to understand. And again, we'll get to the arrow functions later in the third course, but for right now, I just want you to be aware that they exist and that really they're just a different syntax for writing functions. The last thing that we need to talk about in terms of our lesson today on functions is the difference between functions and methods in JavaScript. It can be a little bit confusing because these two terms are basically interchangeable in JavaScript, and you've already heard me use the term method sometimes and functions other times. So it's helpful to know a little bit about what the two terms mean and why they're interchangeable. Essentially, in JavaScript, when you have a function that belongs to an object, it's called a method. So for example, we have the string object, and there are functions that belong to string objects like to uppercase or to lowercase. And when we have a function like that that belongs to the string object, it's called a method. It's called the to uppercase method because it belongs to the string object. Or another example, with arrays we have the push method, which is a function that belongs to the array object. Okay, so when we push something into an array, we're using the push method, and we use the term method for that. Now, in reality in JavaScript, everything is an object. So in that sense, every function belongs to an object of one sort or another. And in fact, early on in this lesson, we wrote a function called doStuff. But doStuff, since it doesn't explicitly belong to some other object, it does belong to the window. And you could actually write window.doStuff, and that will actually work. So if we go back to our code here, and I come in here and I uncomment out this thing and I put window.doStuff, you'll see if I save that and come back and test it over here, it actually functions. Because ultimately my doStuff function belongs to the window object. Now we don't often, if a function belongs to the window object, we don't often do this. Occasionally we do, but very rarely will we put window.doStuff in there. We'll just call doStuff. And in that case, we'll call it a function. But when a function more explicitly is set to work with a particular object, we're more likely to call it a method. So that's where the difference in terminology comes from. But in reality, in JavaScript, all functions are methods. So the two terms really are interchangeable. So if you hear the term method and you're confused by that, just think, oh yeah, that's a function, and that's fine. Okay, great. We've learned a lot about functions in this lesson, and you've already learned a lot of JavaScript. And along with the challenges, you'll really get good at the JavaScript syntax, and you'll get good at being able to make simple programs function. And from here, we get to start doing some much more interesting things where we start working with content on web pages and manipulating web pages. So this course only gets more fun from here. So stick with it and keep working on the lessons, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.